I'd wake up, shuffle to the kitchen and find him already there, nursing a cup of black coffee, scrolling through his phone like I wasn't even in the room. Morning, I'd mumble. He'd nod, barely looking up. That was it. That was us now. Once upon a time we couldn't stop talking. Now silence was the default. I sat across from him, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee. My phone vibrated on the counter. I grabbed it quickly, read the message and locked the screen before he could glance over. His eyes flicked up just for a second. I saw the suspicion there, but he said nothing. I could feel his questions hanging in the air, unspoken. That evening I told him I was meeting a friend for dinner. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask when I'd be back. Just a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that barely felt real. I left without another word, feeling the weight of his gaze on my back. Later, over dinner, I casually brought up the idea of spending a few days at my family's house. A change of scenery, some time away, maybe it could help us reset. He hesitated, then agreed. I could see the hope in his eyes. He thought this was about us. That night, long after he had gone to bed, I stood on the balcony, phone pressed to my ear. He has no idea, I whispered, suppressing a laugh. What was that? His voice cut through the darkness. I turned sharply. He was standing in the doorway watching me. I forced a smile. Just a colleague. The driveway stretched long and winding, leading up to the house I once called home. The place hadn't changed. Same wide porch, same wooden rocking chairs, same heavy scent of pine lingering in the air. As we stepped out of the car, my brother was already there, leaning against the railing, arms crossed, watching us. His grin was warm, but his eyes held something else. He pulled me into a hug, holding on just a second too long, his hand resting lightly on my waist before he let go. My husband noticed. Inside, my mother greeted us with a careful smile. She kissed my cheek, lingered for a moment, then turned to him with polite warmth, but there was something in her gaze, like she was evaluating him, weighing something in her mind. At dinner, the tension thickened. My brother swirled his wine, smirking. She always had a thing for the wrong guys, he said casually. My mother chuckled, my stomach tightened, my husband's grip on his fork shifted. I laughed, too quick, too forced. He didn't laugh. He was watching now, really watching, and I knew he felt it. I wasn't just bringing him home. I was bringing him into something else entirely. Morning sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the table. The scent of coffee lingered, but the air felt heavier. He walked in just as my brother pulled me into a hug, his hands resting too firmly on my back, his lips close to my ear as he murmured something low enough that only I could hear. My laugh was soft, natural, but when I glanced at my husband, I saw the stiffness in his posture, the way his jaw clenched. He noticed. Later, we walked down the old trail behind the house, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound between us for a while. Finally, he spoke, calm, measured, but there was an edge to it. When did we stop trying? I exhaled, looking at him, really looking, and for the first time in months I saw the man I used to love. I reached for his hand, and before I could second-guess it, our lips met. It was soft, familiar, almost safe. But later, as he scrolled through my phone, his heart pounded. Some messages were missing. Deliberately erased. The dining room buzzed with laughter, the scent of roasted meat and red wine filling the space. My mother poured another glass, eyes twinkling as she recounted stories from my past. Old relationships, mistakes, men who had come and gone. My husband listened, smiling at first, but I saw it shift. The way his fingers tightened around his fork, the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He tried to steer the conversation, asking about my past in ways that felt casual, but each time the subject changed effortlessly. My mother would laugh, my brother would smirk, and suddenly, we'd be talking about something else entirely. Later, as he stepped outside for air, he heard them. My mother's voice, hushed but clear. You know, she always comes back. My brother chuckled, low and knowing. My husband stood frozen in the dark, the weight of their words pressing against his ribs. As he walked back inside, he felt it fully now, not imagined, not paranoia. He wasn't just an outsider in this house. He was an intruder, a guest in a story that had already been written, one where he wasn't meant to be. Candlelight flickered against the walls, the low hum of soft music filling the room. He had planned the evening carefully. Wine, her favorite meal, small reminders of the life they once had. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. As they talked, he leaned in, brushing his lips against hers, and for a moment, it felt like before. Her body softened, her fingers curled into his, and for the first time in months he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could fix this. But when he pulled away, something in her expression shifted. Doubt, hesitation, something unspoken lingering behind her gaze. Hours later he stirred in his sleep, reaching for her. The bed was empty. His pulse quickened as he stepped toward the window, drawn by something he didn't want to see. Outside, on the terrace, she stood with her brother. Their heads were close, voices hushed, bodies angled toward each other in a way that made his stomach twist. Her hand brushed against his arm. Too slow, too familiar. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't supposed to see this. But now he couldn't look away. Morning light spilled through the curtains as he sat at the edge of the bed, watching her move around the room, acting like everything was normal. He wasn't going to confront her, not yet. He needed to be careful to pick the right moment. Over breakfast he leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "I saw you last night." She hesitated just for a second, then forced a casual smile. "Couldn't sleep. Just needed some air." His stomach twisted. With him. The mug in her hands trembled slightly before she set it down. "You're being paranoid." But her voice wasn't steady, and when he asked, softer this time, "Are you hiding something from me?" she turned away, pretending not to hear. By evening the house felt different. Her brother walked through it like he owned the place, shoulders loose, smirk knowing. Every time he spoke there was something mocking in his tone. Every time she was near he was closer than he needed to be. At dinner their mother sipped her wine, watching everything unfold with quiet amusement. "Some things can't be changed," she said lightly, looking right at him. "Everything is going exactly as it should." And just like that he realized he was the only one who didn't know the rules of the game. The house was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the wooden floors. They had all gone out, his wife, her brother, their mother, leaving him alone for the first time. He didn't hesitate. Moving quickly he started searching. Drawers, cabinets, anything that could give him the answers he felt slipping just out of reach. In the living room an old wooden chest caught his eye. Inside, buried beneath stacks of papers and forgotten trinkets, he found a photo album. Flipping through the pages his stomach tightened. His wife and her brother. Always together, always close, but something about the way they touched, the way they looked at each other, made his skin crawl. The poses weren't just affectionate. They were intimate. Then he saw it, photos where someone had been erased. Faces cut out, figures blurred beyond recognition. His pulse pounded as he turned another page and a folded piece of paper slipped free. Hands shaking, he unfolded it, reading the words scrawled in ink. "We will always be together. No one can ever take you from me." His breath caught. This wasn't just family history. This was something else entirely. The photographs wouldn't leave his mind. The words in that letter burned into his thoughts. "No one can ever take you from me." He couldn't breathe. He spent hours pacing, trying to make sense of it, but nothing fit. His wife, her brother, their mother. He was surrounded by something he didn't understand, something that had been in motion long before he arrived. That evening her mother left for town, and her brother found him in the den, a bottle of whiskey in hand. "You look like you need this," he said, pouring 2 glasses. He didn't argue. He drank, needing the burn, needing something to pull him out of his head. Dinner was tense. Her brother smirked, swirling his glass. "You ever wonder if you really know her?" he mused. "I mean, if she really belongs to you?" The words landed like a punch. His wife stared at her plate. His grip tightened on the glass. Later he stepped outside for air, mind spinning. She had spent the entire afternoon tending to her garden, carefully watering and pruning each plant. Among them her favorite flower stood tall, but its roots seemed too shallow, struggling to hold firm in the soil. Inside he wasn't alone. She was there, her brother's wife. She saw the tension in his face, the weight on his shoulders. "You don't deserve this," she murmured, fingers barely grazing his wrist. The moment stretched, unspoken things passing between them. She called her friend, an experienced gardener, for advice. With steady hands he helped her replant it properly, pressing the soil down to secure it in place. Then she kissed him. It was slow, unexpected, a release he didn't know he needed. But before he could even process it, a sharp inhale cut through the air. The door stood open. His wife. That night, a soft drizzle fell over the garden. By morning, everything was covered in a fresh layer of moisture. "He made my flower wet while I was sleeping." The rain had done its job, leaving her plants refreshed and vibrant, ready to bloom again. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there watching, her arms crossed, lips pressed together in something closer to disappointment than anger. He scrambled for words, but nothing felt right. It wasn't. She shook her head, cutting him off before he could even begin. Behind her, her brother leaned in the doorway, arms folded, smirking like he had just won a bet. Told you, he chuckled, shaking his head. It was only a matter of time. His chest tightened. He expected fury, accusations, maybe even tears. Instead, she just exhaled, as if this confirmed something she had already known. You always had doubts, didn't you? She murmured, tilting her head. And now you proved yourself right. His mouth went dry. Something was wrong. This wasn't betrayal. This was expected. Like they had been waiting for him to fall. He turned, grabbing his keys, heart pounding. He needed to leave, needed distance. But as he reached the driveway, his stomach dropped. His car, boxed in by her brother's truck, blocked completely. His pulse pounded. This wasn't just an accident. He wasn't supposed to leave. Not yet. His hands tightened around the keys, his pulse hammering in his ears. I'm leaving, he said, voice sharp, controlled. She stood on the porch, arms loose at her sides, expression unreadable. She didn't beg, didn't argue. Just nodded, as if this had already been decided long before. Go then, she murmured, tilting her head slightly. You were never part of this family. The words landed cold, final. Behind her, her brother leaned against the doorway, watching, smiling like none of this mattered. His stomach twisted. He wanted to demand answers, to force the truth out of them, but he already knew he would never get it. The moment his car finally moved, his body sagged against the seat. The road stretched ahead, empty, unfamiliar. He was free. But the questions gnawed at him. What had he missed? Why had no one fought for him to stay? Why had her mother, through it all, remained so calm? The truth lingered just out of reach. Days later, his phone buzzed. A message. A photo. Her back at the house, standing next to her brother, smiling. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be.